What are you doing? Where are you taking her? She is alive." The ambulance attendants were stunned when a man ran up to them and literally ripped out of their hands the stretcher on which the 10-year-old girl was lying. The car flew out onto the road suddenly. The little girl did not even have time to remember how she ended up on the pavement. The driver stopped and, running out of the car, immediately called an ambulance. The paramedics arrived in a matter of seconds and, having carefully examined the girl, looked at each other. "I think there is no point in taking her to the intensive care unit," the young man said. "It will not help her." The other one nodded and put the little girl on a stretcher. They covered her with a sheet. A middle-aged man ran up, suddenly hearing the sound of a police car pulling up to the scene. He decided it was his professional duty to intervene. The paramedics didn't even realize what was going on when the man ran up to them and pulled back the sheet and shouted in a hysterical manner, "What are you standing there like a statue? Bring a scalpel and alcohol. She's only allergic, and you're about to bury her." They threw the stretcher on the pavement and rushed to the car. After a few minutes, the man leaned over the girl's body and made a deep incision and said, "That's it. Everything will be all right now." When the paramedics saw that the girl was breathing, they were shocked. "This just can't be." They exclaimed in unison, "Who are you? God sent you to us." Lowering his eyes down, the man replied, "I was a surgeon in a previous life, but now I am nothing." He was about to leave when the orderly pulled him by the sleeve and said, "Where are you going? Don't you want to know the fate of your patient?" "Of course I do. But I don't think that's very appropriate." No, you're coming with us. It's out of the question. Especially since our department is short on top-notch specialists like you. Surgery is your calling. I don't know why you gave it up, but I assure you, you must return to the profession." The chief physician looked at him with admiration. "I didn't think that there were still people in our world who cared," he said with a smile. "It is right out of the realm of fantasy that a person does not pass by, all immersed in his own problems and worries. Medicine can be proud of people like you. This is a worthy act of a real man who has not yet lost his moral character. I feel it's my duty to offer you a job. We're in need of specialists. You see, there are always more patients in need of help than there are doctors willing to give it." "You flatter me," the man replied. "And you don't know everything about me. I must tell you something before you hire me. It is possible that after what you learn about me, you will abandon your decision." He hadn't worked as a surgeon in over 5 years, not since Evelyn had passed away. He still vividly remembers the day the search for his missing wife was completed. Her body was found in a wooded area. "You see, son, you can't be so desperate." Camille's mother reassured him. "She'll be found. You just have to wait a little longer." His mother's words passed over his ears, because he realized that if Evelyn was still alive, she should have made herself known by now. But that hadn't happened yet, so there was nothing to hope for. Stephen filed a police report as soon as his wife didn't come home from work. "Maybe you had a fight and she just walked out on you. What was the relationship like in your family? Did she have any reason to fear for her life?" There are so many cases like this now that you'll excuse me, please, but we can't take the word of husbands and wives. We have to check everything and make sure that this disappearance is not just another family conflict, as it happens when a wife comes to write a report about beatings, and a few days later it turns out that she and her husband have reconciled. She takes a report, or the husband comes to write a missing persons report, and it turns out that she went to her lover, or they had a fight, and she ran away to her mom for a few days to cry, and they go back to living like nothing happened. And we have a lot of red tape, the policeman reasoned, carefully recording everything Stephen said on paper. These questions struck him to the core. He expected anything but this. "Are you out of your mind? What are you even talking about? We were a beautiful family. We never fought. Where would she go without telling me? There's no such thing." And he wasn't lying. He'd met Evelyn at the institute when they'd first enrolled as freshmen. A pretty, modest girl who did well in her studies. She always had something to talk about. She was such an interesting conversationalist that, listening to her, Stephen wondered when she had time to read so many books, watch so many movies. It seemed to him that she knew everything and about everything. When he told him this, Evelyn grinned and guffawed. "Come on, you exaggerating," she said. "We did not come to study philology after all, but medicine. Here this knowledge is quite useless. but I always felt it was my duty to know more than I should. In the third year they got married and Evelyn moved in with Stephen and his mother Camille. "If you want, we can go live with your mom," Stephen said just before the wedding. "If it would make you feel more comfortable, we'd rather visit her, like on weekends. And when we go to work, get on our feet, you and your housing issue will be solved." Evelyn, on the contrary, wanted to move out as soon as possible from her mother, who criticized her every now and then for her choice of profession and social circle because of her husband. "Where are you going to get married?" Emily was indignant when Evelyn told her the date of the wedding. "You didn't even consult me. I'm your mother, by the way. I've been dragging you around all your life. You could have asked me for a blowjob just to be nice. What if the kids come? What will you be? You'll get an education, and you'll sit at home and cook borscht for your husband. And that's why you worked so hard for so many years to get a gold medal." It wasn't the first time Emily had started this conversation. Since Evelyn had a young man, the girl's relationship with her mother had deteriorated. Emily was afraid that her daughter would do something stupid and then find herself in the same difficult situation as she was. "You and the mother, listen," she said. "I'm not going to give you bad advice. You know it yourself, that I wish you nothing but good. I don't understand, why do you need an extra burden now? Learn to build a job first, make a career, and then think about marriage. You'll always find a man, but you'll have to fight for a good job. Do you want to live like me, sharing a small one-room apartment with your child? But at least I had this cage. And you have nothing of your own." Emily separated from her husband 3 years after the birth of their daughter. Their relationship with Christopher was always complicated, but they were young and sincerely believed that they could overcome everything. After the wedding, they moved to live in the apartment Emily got from her grandmother, who caught up in time, using the help of good friends, and registered her granddaughter there, so that the apartment did not leave the family. "Yes, the place is certainly a little small," said Emily, looking around the 5-meter kitchen with shabby repairs. "But, as they say, it's a tight squeeze. By the time you think about children, you will need to make repairs here, and buy new furniture, and in general, to separate some area for the child, so that at night to sleep at night did not interfere." She was just saying that as a diversion. Christopher didn't mind if there were children even in the hut. Emily, on the other hand, did not want to give birth early. She hoped that they would have a child only after they were on their feet and could get a decent apartment. "Emily, what are you talking about?" Christopher wondered. "Be thankful that your mother and grandmother managed at least to keep these meters for themselves and put us here. Our peers, by the way, live in dormitories and do not complain about life. And you got a whole Khrushchevka, although you have never worked a day and we have no children." But Emily found no reason to be happy. She was always turned away from the reality in which she lived. Her parents' admonitions about a prosperous future after graduation and employment at the factory caused her only anger, but she had no opportunity to organize her life in any other way. Neither did she. Her mom and dad lived like this for a long time. Their fathers and mothers survived in much worse conditions. That's how she was going to live. Having learned that a young childless couple moved into a full-fledged single room, neighbors Shishukov saw on the bench near the entrance, not afraid, gave a bribe. Whispered conversations, local residents. "Who were you? A whole apartment, Druzhil. That can't be true." Everyone lived on top of each other, which made Emily even more annoyed. In the morning, she tried to leave the house with the dawn so as not to run into neighbors in the stairwell, and return home when the working hours were coming to an end. Watching his wife, Christopher only grinned. He sincerely did not understand her dislike of the local community. He himself was always polite and friendly with his neighbors. Bad luck with his wife, heard once pass by Emily's entrance the conversations of neighbors. So she walks by. No hello, no goodbye, and will not say. In a word, a bore. And where do they raise such people? In our time, girls didn't behave like that. And these current ones? Oh, pish on them. When was Evelyn born? Emily's relationship with Christopher had deteriorated completely. If before that moment they quarreled rarely and only on occasion, then, when on Emily, in addition to the cares of the house fell and all the duties of raising a daughter, scandals in the family did not stop. Why are you always yelling? Christopher was angry. The child is sleeping. The neighbors also have ears. We'll soon be looked at as crazy. Where do you see such concerts at 1 o'clock in the morning? You're the only one who behaves like that, madam. She can't boil milk because she's tired. Some people cook all their lives in a shared kitchen and wait for their turn in the evenings after work. Tired too, by the way, but they don't throw such tantrums. Life was becoming more and more unbearable. And when Vera was 3 years old, Emily decided to get a divorce. "You're not even registered here?" she said when Christopher asked what they would do after the divorce. "You're living here illegally, basically. Go back to your mother where you came from. My grandmother's going to make sure I stay in this apartment with the baby. We have a legal right to live here." Christopher had nothing to contradict her. Although he was Emily's legal husband, he had never registered in the apartment. Grandmother was strongly against it, and he did not insist and solve the issue according to the law. She had good connections, she was a person influential enough, and Christopher was afraid of the problems he could face if he did not consider her opinion. After the divorce, he returned to his mother's apartment, and Emily stayed with Evelyn in a single room. At first, Christopher sought out meetings with Evelyn, and for the sake of it even tried to establish a relationship with Emily. But after a while he realized that all this was absolutely pointless. His ex-wife treated him with such disdain that it was extremely unpleasant for him to communicate with her, even for the sake of his daughter. At a certain point, Christopher stopped looking for meetings with Evelyn, and when she grew up and could already decide for herself whether to communicate with her father or not, it was too late to establish relations. Evelyn had her own interests and hobbies, and she had nothing to talk to her father about. He saw his daughter only at the funeral. When Emily called him and told him about the terrible tragedy that had happened in their family, he was in shock. How could this have happened? What did the police say? He asked. Emily, don't be silent, please. You and I are not old people, and all the offenses long ago. It is time to leave all the past. Our daughter died. You weren't at the wedding? So come at least to the funeral? She said stiffly, ignoring his questions. And yes, please behave yourself. Evelyn's husband is very depressed, and we are all in shock here. You try to start a fight with me, I'll have you kicked out of the wake. Didn't even blink an eye. I hope I made myself clear. She hasn't changed a bit in all these years. Just as unscrupulous as she was when she was young, only she's not the same age. After the funeral, Christopher got to talking to Stephen. Accept my sincere condolences, he said. I didn't know Evelyn at all. She is my daughter, but only on paper. She wasn't even at your wedding, but it's not my fault. How? There's a difference now, Stephen said quietly. They had another drink and parted, saying goodbye to Stephen. Emily said, if you need any help, don't hesitate to call. Yes, I realize that we have not always had a warm, friendly relationship, but I know that you love my daughter very much. You've proven that over the years, and I love her very much. And now she's gone. We share a common grief, and I'm sure we'll always have something to talk about. Stephen nodded and hugged his mother-in-law tightly. For the first time in many years, he felt a real warmth of kinship when he talked to her. The investigation had dragged on for a long time, but it had never led to any results. Would they never find the murderer? He asked Camille doomedly. He's downing another shot of vodka. I don't understand how they work. It's like they don't give a damn that my wife is no longer alive. Stephen, calm down, please. They've got a carload of people like us. As cynical as it sounds, people go missing every day. And crimes are committed every day. She's your wife to you, but she's like my own daughter to me. To them, our little girl is just another victim, one of many in the statistics, and there's nothing we can do about it. Camille felt truly sorry for her son, but there was nothing she could do to help him. Seeing himself sinking further and further to the bottom every day, she tried to reach out to him, but it was absolutely useless. Stephen was wallowing in his own worries. He was interested in nothing but his own grief. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Evelyn so miserably lying on the damp ground, and it made him feel uncomfortable. One day these memories surfaced to him during an operation, and Stephen, who was unable to cope with the emotional impulse that suddenly overtook him, took off his gloves and ran out of the office. After a few seconds, he came to his senses and, opening the door, said to the assistant, I have all the notes on this patient left in my office. This case is very different from the others. I have to look at it, closing the door behind me. He, barely holding back the tears and panic attacks that had been plaguing him for months, ran into a neighboring office and rolled up his sleeves and injected himself. It wasn't the first month he'd taken the medication under signature because it was easier and more convenient. It was always easier to deal with his emotions on his own, using whatever tools were available, than to ask someone for help. Stephen did not want anyone to see him suffer. 10 minutes later, he was back in the office and performed the operation brilliantly. When the head doctor called him in, he had no idea how their conversation would end. "Stephen, I understand," John said. "You recently lost your wife. It's very hard for you right now, but please understand me too." He hesitated because he didn't know how to inform one of the leading surgeons of his decision. Before summoning Stephen to his office and starting this conversation with him, the chief surgeon thought for a long time. John was not sure that he was doing the right thing by making such a decision. But he couldn't stand to see what was happening, to turn a blind eye to it, to cover for Stephen all the time. "What are you talking about? What are you talking about?" Stephen asked cautiously. "I don't really understand what you mean by that." "I really appreciate you as a specialist. You're not just a qualified doctor, you're a doctor from God," John continued. "But unfortunately, your emotional state lately leaves much to be desired. I have repeatedly turned a blind eye to the fact that you take medications under your signature and take them without a doctor's prescription and control. You yourself know what you need, you know better. After all, you have higher qualifications, you are able to assess the situation. But what happened today, Stephen, it's over the top. Please don't misunderstand me. I can't keep a doctor in the hospital who's high all the time. Any careless movement, loss of balance of consciousness, and not only will you go to jail, but I'll go with you. I'm responsible. Already responsible for the condition of the patients you operate on. I think it's best for you and for us if you leave the practice temporarily. I can get you an internship at a clinic I know. It's a good environment and a decent salary, but surgical practice isn't for you right now. I'm sure it's only temporary. When you come to your senses, you can go back to your old job. But for now, this is it." "Stephen, I can't believe what I'm hearing." He couldn't get his head around what was happening. He was angry at him, at himself, at everything and everyone around him. He couldn't believe that his life, which had been so prosperous and happy just a few months ago, was crumbling before his eyes. There was nothing left for him to do but watch everything he loved, everything he held so dear, turn to ashes. "Am I hearing you right, John? Are you firing me?" he asked me, one of the best lead surgeons around. "You are now pointing me to the door." "Stephen, please take your pride," replied John, who was trying to remain calm. He himself was extremely uncomfortable with this conversation, just as what was happening to Stephen evoked no emotion in him other than genuine pity and compassion for the man. "You have to realize that we're not playing games here. People's lives depend on us. And that's okay. I'm willing to put up with you being on medication and scheduled surgeries all the time, even though that's illegal too. If anyone ever finds out about this, they'll fire not only you, but me. And then we'd all end up in jail. But we have a hospital with a heavy patient, when the count is literally seconds, and every careless movement can cost a life. Do you have any idea what would happen if you are in such a state? Someone will allow something wrong. I never have and I never will. I'm a professional, and I can operate in any condition." He snapped, but deep down he knew John was right. He was losing the last pillar that kept him afloat. After Evelyn's death, the only reason he woke up in the morning was to help people. Stephen knew he could do it better than anyone else. When he realized he was out of a job, he felt bad. The practice of surgery had always been everything to him. He couldn't imagine his life without it. "I authorize you to resign," John continued. "You are an excellent doctor, and you have saved more than one life during the whole period of your practice. So I think it would be unfair to deprive you of the opportunity to continue doing what you love in the future." He didn't say a word. Stephen took a sheet of paper and a pen. In a few minutes the statement was ready, and leaving it on the table, he silently left the office of the head doctor. "Son, why didn't you agree to go to work in a private clinic?" Camille asked. When Stephen returned home and told her about the conversation with the head doctor. "Maybe I should have said yes. You still have a mortgage to pay, don't you?" "No, of course you can stay at my place. I don't forbid it. On the contrary, I'm sure it's better that way. You need to come to your senses and get back to life. But the credit won't wait. Should I give up this apartment? I don't know what to do. You should think about it and decide. You can't just let it go. After all, you've been paying it off for so many years, there's not much left. Mom, what are you talking about? Stephen didn't understand how she could talk about apartments and pharmacies when his world had fallen apart with Evelyn's death. The nice things you say about me. I've been asked more than once to take John up on his offer. After all these years of brilliant surgical practice, you think I should go to work as a general practitioner in some private shop where people come just to get a couple $10 prescriptions for some pills? Thanks, Mom. You know how to be supportive in a time of need. Stephen, stop acting like a little kid. Camille resented her son's behavior. She understood that he was having a hard time. But he couldn't stay like this forever. You need to come to your senses. Start doing something, not to think all the time. Believe me, you're behaving, and it's not going to do you any good. And a job in this, as you put it, private shop is much better than no job at all. What are you going to do now? Sit at home all day and look at pictures of you two together? Stephen, you're acting like this before you have a serious nervous breakdown. That's not the answer. He didn't want to hear anything. He didn't care about his job or the apartment that he and Evelyn had spent years saving for a down payment. They hadn't even lived in it since they'd finished the renovations and moved in. It's only been 3 years since Evelyn died. He'd never been there. He was scared to be alone in the place where they had once been so happy. For the last few years, Evelyn and Stephen had been seriously considering having a child. Whereas throughout the past years they had been solely interested in practicing medicine and pursuing their careers. 2 months before Evelyn disappeared, they were seriously discussing becoming parents. It seems to me that if you plan on it, it would be this year, Evelyn said. You realize we're not that young for this. We're not 20 or even 25 years old anymore. We don't know if you and I can even have children. A cobbler without boots, laughed Stephen in response. The doctors themselves have not been examined. That's how it is. Other people's lives and destinies are dearer to you and me than our own. Listen, but don't tell me. You've had more surgeries in the last few months than I can count. The first had a pretty busy schedule too. He keeps coming and coming. And he's going to start saving lives. It's getting to the point where she's running to the doctor for every sneeze. Where do they get all this time? I want to do the same. She worked as a general practitioner at the city hospital and was one of the best doctors. Always so polite, courteous, and sympathetic. Patients loved Evelyn, and she found some of them overly exciting. What are you worried about? You see, the scan shows that everything with your lungs is completely normal. There are no pathologies. Why did you go? Because you have allergies. You took tests. I prescribed medication. Evelyn reassured another pensioner who had waited a week to see her favorite doctor. When Evelyn passed away, people brought flowers to the hospital door. They mourned her in the hallways, discussed her unjust, cruel death, and couldn't accept that it had happened to her. She was such a kind and bright person, the women who came to the hospital to see her reasoned. She was so loved and respected by everyone. Such a real person. There are almost none like her now. Every day Stephen was sinking deeper and deeper into depression. And no matter how hard Camille tried to bring him to his senses, she couldn't help her son. All day long he sat in his room, cuddled up with photos and albums that he had brought back from his apartment with Evelyn, looking at them. He drank uncontrollably and eventually stopped feeling intoxicated. In an evening, he could down more than half a liter of vodka. When Stephen finally lost his grip on reality, he drifted off to sleep. Camille managed with great difficulty to persuade her son to sign a power of attorney for her. Well, do you want to do nothing? Then at least let me help you. She begged him every night with tears in her eyes. It's a shame about the apartment, so I'll at least rent it out. When the money comes in, we'll pay off the mortgage. Do what you want. Stephen snapped when he got tired of these daily conversations. We'll go tomorrow and I'll sign everything, and you can do whatever you want with the money. I don't need this apartment without Evelyn. I don't need anything without her. Mom, I don't want to live, okay? I don't know how I'm going to live without her, or why I want to live at all. He was hysterical and Camille calmed him down. She stroked the green Stephen's head, realizing that such behavior was provoked not so much by heartache as by the daily consumption of huge amounts of alcohol. thought about how she could help her son in other ways. "Stephen, why don't you see a counselor?" "I beg you," she said, continuing to stroke his head. "You can't go on like this. I'm not saying you have to forget Evelyn and just move on. I'm saying that you need to come to your senses and somehow move on without her. I know it's hard, but life doesn't end there. Think about how she'd feel if she knew you'd let your life go down the drain. I'm sure she wouldn't be happy about it." But it was like Stephen was behind glass. His mother's words, like other people's, were nothing to him. He continued to drink and to go over entrusted photographs all day long. Life lost all meaning for him. It went on like this until he was actually on the verge of death. That brought him to his senses. He was still suffering, but he began to take some steps to get back to life. "God, what have you done?" Camille exclaimed when she returned home and saw her son lying unconscious. She had been traveling on business that day, and it was one of the few days Camille had gone away for so long, leaving Stephen alone. She didn't have time to take off her jacket and boots because she immediately rushed to call an ambulance. Stephen showed no signs of life and Camille was afraid she had lost her son. "Come here, please." She was literally dragging the orderly by the sleeve. "I come home and he's lying unconscious on the floor. Tell me he's alive, isn't he? Isn't he going to be okay?" Leaning over to Stephen, the orderly examined him carefully, then said, "But you drink more, and we'll take you far away from Georgia." When Camille heard this, she got angry. "Who are you, a student from yesterday who's acting so smart?" she said angrily. "Where are your doctors? They're supposed to come with you when you're called. But you've recruited young people. People now, what, do not live or what?" But the doctor who came up a few minutes later confirmed the orderly's words. "Woman, please calm down," strictly said a middle-aged man with a serious expression. "And do not scold our trainees." "All." The young man correctly said, "Your son has the strongest intoxication. He is in a borderline condition. If we don't get him to a hospital right now and get him on an IV, we could lose him. Please don't interfere with us doing our job." Camille stepped aside to allow the orderlies to put Stephen on the stretcher. "I'm coming with you," she said stiffly. "I hope that at least this is out of the question." "Please," the doctor replied. "You have every right to do so. Let's go." She spent 2 days in the hospital before she was allowed to see her son. Both day and night the woman did not soften her eyes, sitting in the corridor and listening to the footsteps of the doctor, who went in and out of Stephen's room without saying a word to her. Camille waited patiently, and when she finally heard your son come to his senses. "You can visit him, but only for a little while." The doctor spoke calmly. It definitely meant that the most critical point had been passed. Camille tried to calm down. There was so much she wanted to say to Stephen, but she realized that now was not the right time. He needed support, not moralizing. And she, as a mother, just had to give him her shoulder. "I'm sorry, Mom," Stephen said quietly when he saw Camille. "I'm sorry, please, I miscalculated. I'll never drink so much again." He remembered those days like a blur. When he came to, it was as if his whole life had flashed before his eyes. He didn't want to die and got really scared when he realized he had had too much to drink. The day it all happened, Stephen had switched Evelyn as usual. Sitting on the floor, he went through their pictures together, going over every moment he had spent around her in his head. He hadn't noticed he'd started drinking. He hadn't felt the condition as acutely lately because he was hardly ever sober. When the last drops were left on the bottle, Stephen realized that he had had too much to drink. But it was too late. Half an hour later, he began to lose consciousness. Everything doubled in his eyes. He couldn't even call his mother to ask her to come home. He didn't remember how he finally lost his grip on reality, how, after losing consciousness, he fell to the floor. Those moments were not printed in his memory, but he clearly remembered how he came to his senses, how he opened his eyes and found that he was in a hospital room. There was an IV attached to his arm. His head hurt badly, and he could hardly move. "I've saved people's lives before, and now it turns out I've been saved." He fell into a deep sleep and woke up only 2 days later. Immediately he saw his mother, how glad he was that she had come. "He felt so guilty in front of her," said Camille. Stroked his son's head. "Maybe we should see a psychologist after all. Will they help you?" "I'm sure they will. Or let's go straight to a psychiatrist. Isn't there something we can do to treat your condition?" "Medication. But you can't go on like this. You've ruined yourself." She took her son's hand and cried. Stephen could hardly hold back her tears either. After the severe intoxication, he could hardly move, but he couldn't feel his hands at all. They couldn't obey him very well. "Mommy, I promise you that I will definitely talk to the doctor," whispered Stephen. "Now I'll just come to my senses a little, and I'll talk to you right away. Or you could go and talk to me, ask me what you can do for me. I'm having a really hard time myself. I can't take it anymore. Mom, I'm really sick. I don't know how to go on. I don't know anything at all." It was the first time in a long time that he had said it so openly, out loud, without trying to sound stronger than he was. At that moment, Camille realized the ice had broken. Stephen was finally ready to go back to his old normal life. Only he didn't know how. "Son, don't worry," Camille replied. "I will definitely talk to the doctor. I will help you. Everything will be all right, I promise you. If we can't get help here, we'll go to other doctors. I'll get you out of this. You'll have another life." After leaving the room, Camille went straight to the doctor's office. "I'm not sure your son can handle his abuse on his own. He's been drinking for quite some time." "Well, you can see that," he said. "I can offer you medication. In my opinion, this will be the best way out of the situation. But do not forget that the patient's own desire to be cured and return to normal life plays the most important role." "Yes, doctor," of course answered Camille. "He wants to. He really wants to. We were talking just now, and he said it himself, that he can't live like this anymore. But he really needs help, because he doesn't know how to get out of this." Stephen spent almost a whole year in hospital. Every day he woke up thinking that his past life had to be finished once and for all. Stephen took all his medications on schedule, started eating right, and exercised. Camille visited him every day, bringing him warm, delicious, homemade food. Just before he was discharged, the doctor called the woman in for a serious talk. A happy Camille entered the office with a smile. She didn't even know how to thank their savior. But the man said it was unnecessary. "Stephen really is much better," he said. "I don't think there will be any more problems with alcohol. But you have to realize he's been under a lot of stress. After all, losing a beloved wife doesn't go away. It's not for a year or two or even 10 years, it's for life. His psychological state is still severe. Even if he does not demonstrate it, still you should realize it. Therefore, before his return home, please remove, all objects that could somehow provoke the onset of a new crisis state. And he needs to find something to do. What is that? It has to be a job. He just has to do something, be busy. If he goes back to lying on the couch, spending all day long in four walls again, all our efforts will be for nothing." When Stephen came home and didn't find Evelyn's picture on the nightstand, he immediately yelled at his mother. "Did you put that away?" he asked. "Who gave you permission? Please put my wife's picture back. It's not your stuff. You have no right to dispose of it." "Son, calm down, please," Camille replied. "It's the doctor," he said. "Asked me to remove from your sight all things that might traumatize you. But you looked at the pictures all the time. What did that do to you? Mom, I'm not a little boy anymore. I'm a grown man, and I'm nobody. You hear me? No one has the right to tell me what to do with my wife's memory. Your parents are dead. Their pictures are in your room. You don't put them away because it hurts you to look at them. Who came up with this nonsense? What is this nonsense?" Realizing that Stephen was very angry, Camille realized that she had taken the doctor's advice for nothing. She brought the picture back and, holding it out to her son, said, "Stephen, please forgive me. I really meant well." "Thank you, Mom," he replied. "And I'm sorry I yelled at you. But I want you to understand. It's important to me that the memory of my faith never goes away. That doesn't mean I plan on drinking again. And not drying up, mentally talking to her all day long. No, that will never happen again. I gave myself my word, I gave you my word, and I'm keeping it. But the memory must remain." He put the photograph on the nightstand and gestured for his mother to sit beside him. It was a very good sign. Camille realized that the son had indeed changed a great deal. Until then, he had never called her to his room. So they sat like that until the evening. The next day, Stephen started looking for a job. "Maybe you will pursue a medical career?" Camille asked when she heard Stephen talking on the phone. "Son, Why do you need all these one-off unpleasant part-time jobs, some office jobs? A job in your specialty? You've got a lot of experience. Merit. You're a doctor from God. Any hospital would kill you. Mom, if you haven't forgotten this doctor from God with a not-so-good reputation, Stephen replied. And no one is going to tear me limb from limb. At most, what I'll get is a job as a district officer, or, as John suggested, in a private clinic to sit around. So why don't you give him a call? Talk to him, tell him you've thought about it and you're in. Think about it, son. Why would you look for something else? You'll lose your seniority. It won't be easy to get back into the profession. I'll call you and tell you what I've thought, he grinned. A whole year was walking somewhere thinking, and then suddenly came to his senses and decided to agree. Mom, don't be ridiculous, first of all. And second of all, do you really think he's not going to find out where he's been all year? And it's not even that it's a small world. Think about it. Any clinic willing to hire a good doctor who is simply tired of practicing surgery and wants to take a temporary break. But no clinic will not hire a doctor who almost died from an overdose of alcohol and a year of treatment for the same in the hospital. And now he is characterized as a person with a very unstable psychological and mental state. The path to medicine is closed for me. Mom can only accept it. It's my own fault. For 4 long years he worked wherever he could. During this time, Stephen learned so many different professions and loader and locksmith and electrician. When he was tired of constantly somewhere to get somewhere else, he placed an ad on the internet and began to take private orders. His mother was well off, and she didn't have to spend her pension, which she used to save. The tenants were not going to move out, so Stephen did not have to think about where to get money to pay the mortgage. He was reminded of his faith every day. When he came home from work in the evenings, he sat down across from her, with a glass of water and a piece of black bread, and mentally tell her about his day when she was alive, and they so loved to spend cozy family evenings together. Since he'd gotten out of the hospital, he hadn't had a drink even once on the anniversary, not even when the heartache was overwhelming him. He's been hanging in there. Over time, the craving for alcohol seemed to evaporate. He learned to be sad when he was sober, and that was one of his greatest accomplishments over the years. Listening to Stephen's story, the head doctor shook his head. In all the time he had been talking, Robert had not uttered a word. In fact, Stephen had said everything. That's how it all ended. And life seems to have gotten better, and I quit drinking, and I don't complain about the lack of work. But there's no life and there's no meaning. You know, Robert replied thoughtfully. Those were the first words he'd spoken in the last 2. I'll take my chances. I'm confident that you can justify my trust after what you've done. I have no right not to give you a second chance. You saved a child's life. In front of everyone. No operating room, no special equipment, using only a scalpel. You're not just a surgeon from God, you're a very talented surgeon. There are only a handful of surgeons like you, and I think it's a crime against medicine to let you continue to hammer nails and screw out light bulbs in other people's apartments, and tomorrow we'll do the paperwork. Stephen couldn't believe what he just heard. He could go back to practicing surgery, his life's work after all these years. It just couldn't be. Thanking the head doctor, he was about to leave, but realized that he couldn't help but ask a question that worried him. Can you tell me how the girl I saved is feeling? She's fine. Robert, seeing the sincere excitement in Stephen's eyes, and once again thought to himself that he had done the right thing when he offered him the job. Kind and caring doctors are very few. Such people are worth their weight in gold to any hospital. Yes, she's fine, he replied. You can visit her one of these days when she's on our staff. I think she'll be very happy to see her savior, though I don't think she remembers what you look like. I mean, she was unconscious. Her name is Jenna, by the way. Happy Stephen said goodbye to the head doctor, and, leaving the hospital, headed in the direction of home. At that time, he didn't know that his life would soon change very much. Uncle, how nice of you to come by. Jenna was happy to see Stephen. She immediately remembered him when he saved her life. And before she left for the hospital, she regained consciousness. She saw his face, which she remembered very well. She had a good memory in general. The girl was smart beyond her years. I recognized you. It was you who came to me on the road and pulled me from the other side of the world, when no one believed that I was alive. And how can you remember all this? Stephen was surprised. He was amazed at how much she looked like Evelyn. He hadn't paid any attention to her face on the road, so the resemblance had escaped him. He was too busy saving her life. "How are you feeling?" You're feeling better." "Yes, I'm almost well from that bad uncle who ran over me with his big car, got arrested and put in jail. Can you believe he didn't even try to deny he wasn't watching the road?" "There are such people," sighed Jenna. "There are all kinds of people. There are plenty of scumbags in the world, but don't think about that. Better get well soon." At that moment, a woman with a huge bag of fruit entered the room. She said hello politely and began to arrange the goodies she had brought for the girl on a plate. "Wendy, look, it's the uncle who saved my life," Jenna exclaimed. "Everyone thought I was dead, but he operated on me on the road and I started breathing. Then they took me to the hospital and my uncle came with us, but for some reason he didn't come to see me until today. Apparently he had important things to do," looking admiringly at the surgeon. The woman said, "This is the hero who saved my smart girl's life. Thank you so much. I don't know how to thank you." She shook his hand and Stephen got ready to leave. "Wait, where are you going?" Wendy asked. "Come sit with us. I've got some cakes here. I made some more pies, baked meats. Everything my girl likes. Maybe you'd like something too." "Oh no, really? It's kind of embarrassing." "I'm at work," Stephen replied. "I'll go. Let's have tea later," Wendy insisted. "I haven't thanked you yet." "Do you get a reward for saving your daughter for such a feat?" "Only I didn't bring much money with me. Why don't you come with me to the ATM and then we'll go back to my place and have tea? And by the way, you haven't even introduced yourself. What's your name?" Suddenly, Stephen realized that he had been talking to Jenna Wendy for about half an hour and still hadn't given his name. "My name is Stephen." Extended his hand to the woman again. "It's very nice to meet you." "I don't want any money." "You what?" "It's my professional duty. I took an oath as a doctor to help people who need it, so I won't accept your gratitude. I know you mean it from the bottom of your heart, but please don't hurt me." After a few minutes, Wendy managed to insist that Stephen come to her for tea. And Jenna helped her to do it. "Uncle Stephen, would you like some of Mommy's tea?" she said, breaking the silence in the room. "If she invites you to visit, you go. We're very cozy." "All right," the man gave up. "You talked me into it. Only today I have a late shift. It's not very convenient to visit at this hour. Let me come back tomorrow." "Okay, you write down your phone number. We'll call you and we'll make arrangements." Wendy dictated her number and Stephen left the room. "I have to go to work," he said, closing the door behind him. "Thanks for the pies. It was really nice to meet you. And you, Jenna, behave yourself. I'll come back to see you." The next day he bought flowers and a big cake. He didn't feel comfortable going empty-handed, and Wendy seemed like a very interesting and attractive woman. On the way to her house, he realized that for the first time in a long time since Evelyn's death, he was paying attention to someone. And it was an unfriendly feeling, namely sympathy. He did not expect more than a friendly tea party from this evening. He was interested in talking to his new acquaintance, in finding out what kind of person she was. Talk about life. "Oh, you're here already," Wendy said happily as she opened the door. "Are you so punctual?" "I'm never late," Stephen replied. "And this is for you." Wendy was very much surprised when he handed her flowers, a cake. She obviously did not expect such surprises, but was very grateful for the signs of attention. "What's this about?" she asked. "It's not like we're on a date, just a tea party. Or am I mistaken?" "No, of course you're thinking of the wrong thing." "You what?" "I didn't mean anything by it. I just really wanted to do you a favor and wash my hands." He went into the kitchen where Wendy was already cutting the cake. "You know what I was thinking?" she said, setting the plates of cake slices on the tray. "Why do we have to huddle here like our daughters? Let's go to the room there and the tables can be spread, and there is more space. Unless, of course, you don't mind this very unbusinesslike atmosphere." "Of course I don't mind," Stephen replied with a smile. "Show me where the table is. I've laid it out so it won't be too heavy for you." When they entered the room, his gaze automatically stopped on the table. He almost fainted. Stephen could not believe his eyes. The pictures on the table looked at him. She was so sweet, kind, and smiling, just like in life. The memories came over him again. He stood in the middle of the room, unable to move. Wendy tugged on his sleeve a few times. She didn't realize what was happening. Until a few minutes ago, he had been a cheerful and outgoing person, but now he was unresponsive to anything. When he slowly walked over to the table and picked up the photographs, Wendy froze. She couldn't imagine why he would be interested in a picture of this woman. "I'm sorry if I'm minding my own business," Stephen said in a calm, even tone. His voice sounded so clear that for a second Wendy thought her 10-minute stupor had been imagined. "Who is she?" "Wait, I don't understand anything," she replied. "Who are you talking about?" "I mean the woman in this picture. I want to know who she is. What are you doing with this picture? How did it get here? Let me get the tea, and then I'll tell you all about it." "It's a very long and unhappy story." "No, I want to know now," Stephen insisted. "I don't see how it makes much difference whether you learn it all on an empty stomach or whether you listen. This story is over a cup of tea." She managed to insist. Stephen had nothing to do but pull apart his chair and wait for Wendy to bring a tray of tea into the room. The story he heard was indeed an unhappy welter. "We grew up together in an orphanage." She began her story. "Back then, they were called internet media. My parents at least sometimes took me away for the weekend. The cook was a street kid. We met when we were both 6 years old. She was transferred to us from some other orphanage. I don't know exactly which one. And it's been so many years since then. All that Soviet and even post-Soviet stuff is long gone. You can't find any loose ends now. After graduation, she and I kept in touch. She even lived with me for a while. My parents allowed me to return home with my friend. They felt guilty for putting me in boarding school. But it was such a time, now mothers who seek such alternatives to a full-fledged home education are condemned. But back then, it was the norm. Many people I know grew up in these boarding schools. They were at home only on weekends, and not every week, only a couple times a month. But mine didn't give up on me. In Kharkov, I left my mother at the maternity hospital. She never knew her. She stayed with me for a while, and then she got married and moved to another city. I told her to think about going to school. How did she get on in life? Times were different then when she and I became adults, and she wouldn't do it. But we kept in touch all this time, and then suddenly she came back. My parents were dead by then. My father had a heart attack. It was so sudden that my mother and I didn't even realize it. A few months later, my mother was diagnosed with cancer. She died in my arms. She didn't come back to town alone, but with a baby. I didn't interrogate her about who was the father, who was the daughter. Why didn't I need that? She needed help and a roof over her head. I was ready to help her. She's got a great little girl. She's so smart. I love Jenna very much, but I guess fate wasn't in her favor from childhood. I don't know what happened to her. Only one day she didn't come home. She ran away from all the neighborhoods. I questioned all the neighbors, who she talked to, what happened. Nobody saw her, nobody knows anything. 3 days later, she was found on the road, hit by a car. The driver fled the scene. Nobody bothered to look into it. Never found him. I immediately after that Jenna in a bag and in the guardianship, so that, God forbid, the girl in the orphanage did not end up. I've been raising her myself for 2 years now. She's a very good girl, obedient, smart. She helps me around the house. Fortunately, I was given custody without problems. It's a 2-room apartment after all. Inherited from my parents, a bank account and a lawyer's work did their job. That's how we live. Stephen was shocked by what he heard. He realized that Emily could not have been unaware that she had 2 twin daughters. Or could she? His thoughts were jumbled in his head and he couldn't make a logical chain of events. When Wendy asked him why he was so interested in the photograph, he told her his wife's story. The woman was very surprised. How could this have happened? She began to speculate. Let's think together. It's better not to think and ask. I am sure that Evelyn's mother could not have been unaware of the fact that she had 2 daughters. She probably just gave up on the second one. Here Vanessa ended up first in an orphanage and then on the internet. Stephen had always known that Emily had a difficult temper, but he had never imagined it to this extent. On the way home, he thought about how to talk to her, where to start, what to ask first, if she didn't want to discuss the subject with him at all and refused to talk. The thoughts were running through his head one after another, and he could not organize them in any way. Stephen realized that he needed to calm down and think about everything. When he got home, Camille was still awake. She was sitting in the kitchen, as always, waiting for the fragrant borscht she cooked for her beloved son every weekend. He loved nothing so much as his mother's borscht, but that night he didn't care for it at all. "Son, what's wrong?" asked the worried mother. "Why do you look so gloomy? There's something wrong at work." She was so happy when Stephen was offered a position as a surgeon at the hospital. After everything she'd been through, her favorite son's life was finally getting better. "I told you you'd be able to get back to practice. And you didn't believe me," she said when she learned that Stephen would be working with a surgeon again. His mother was still worried that he might snap. She recalled the terrible time they'd had to endure after Evelyn's death. Camille hoped it was all in the past. Yes, Stephen still remembered his wife every day and went to her grave every chance he got. But over time he had learned to cope with the difficult emotions he felt after losing the woman he loved, and no longer fell into a deep depression. That evening Stephen returned home darker than a cloud. He was not so much upset as very angry. He could not fully explain his mood even to himself. When he found out that Evelyn had a sister who had grown up in an orphanage and who was now gone too, he was ready to grab Emily by the rib cage. Stephen's feelings could only be shared by people who had never had children. He and Evelyn had wanted a child very much, but had not been able to wait for the moment when they would be happy parents. Stephen had always shared the views of his wife, who did not want to give birth to nothing. And when resources became available, the youth was gone. He didn't know if they would ever have children. But it didn't affect his attitude towards his wife. But if he did become a father, he would go to pieces for his child. That's why he was so angry that Emily had so easily abandoned her own daughter to her fate, and for many years had never even once inquired about her fate. Camille listened attentively to her son, and for all the time that he told her about the accident, never once interrupted him. "Mom, I do not understand, but how can you do this?" he asked. "How could you give your daughter to an orphanage and pretend like she never existed?" "I don't understand it, son. Maybe it wasn't what we think it was." Camille began to speculate. What if she didn't know she had 2 daughters? You realize what medicine was like back then. It's not like now when you're still living. Before you grow up, you know who you're having. Maybe they told her the girl was born dead and then lived? Well, I don't know. There could be a lot of possibilities. I wouldn't go into that story if I were you. Either way, I don't believe it. I don't believe it. There's no coming back. Emily, she's not really our person. What do we care what skeleton she hides in her closet? It's her own business. But Stephen strongly disagreed with his mother. He wanted to know the truth, whatever it cost him. "You're wrong," he said. "Why don't I have a right to know? It would do her good to know that her other daughter was dead too. By the way, Varya has a father, if you haven't forgotten. And her and his daughter too, not just Emily. If she gave birth to 2 girls, she must have known about it. What she did with her second daughter, she can tell me face to face. I'm not going to let it go. There's no going back. If you think about it that way, you can live in your own cocoon and not think about other people. That's not right. That's not the way it should be. Indifference is unacceptable, especially in such sensitive matters." That same evening, Stephen called Christopher, who had left him his phone number at the wake. The man was surprised to hear on the other end of the line the voice of a child he had seen only once in his life. "Stephen, is something wrong?" he asked. "Did you find out anything about Evelyn's death?" "No, there is no news about Evelyn yet," he replied. "As soon as there is, I'll let you know. That's not what I'm calling about. I really need to meet you and talk to you." Christopher agreed at once, and the next evening they sat in a cafe and discussed the subject that Stephen was so anxious about. It was strange, Christopher said thoughtfully. It was quite unprofitable for her to get rid of the second child. "We lived at one and the same time with great difficulty. Grandmother managed to make us go to live there instead of in a dormitory, where young families who didn't have children were put at that time. It's a strange story, but I think we should definitely talk to Emily about it. She should tell the truth." "Do you think so too?" Stephen asked. "My mother said it was a thing of the past, that it wasn't worth dredging up the past. You can't bring Evelyn back, just like you can't bring her sister back. But I don't think so. But you're right." Christopher agreed with him. Who cares who it brings back, who it doesn't? It's a very strange philosophy to think that way. If Emily really left the second girl in the orphanage, then the logical question arises, why and why? After all, a second child was an excuse to get a better apartment in a few years. Yes, of course, you would have had to stand in line, but still. On the other hand, when Evelyn was born, you get Vanessa. The country was already starting to fall apart. But it was obvious to many people, at least, that things were about to fall apart. Evelyn was born a few years before perestroika started. So it's not certain that we would have gotten anything. More likely no than yes. But Emily could generally understand that. She's always been like that. Everything was wrong for her. Everything was wrong for her. Life with her and me wasn't great. She turned Evelyn against me. I stayed out of it later because it was more expensive. But I would be interested to know what she was guided by when she made such a decision. Christopher was shocked when he heard Stephen's story. He had no idea that he had 2 daughters, one of whom he had never seen. After the conversation was over, he suddenly felt an overwhelming emotional pain, and his heart ached. Christopher felt very sorry for both Evelyn and Vanessa. He was sure that fate had treated his girls very unfairly. Sometimes he even blamed himself, although he realized that he could not have influenced the circumstances in which they found themselves. The next day was full of determination. Stephen called Emily. She was very glad to hear from him. "Stephen, have you forgotten all about me?" And she answered the phone. "It's been so long since you called or stopped by. I thought you'd come out of your depression and at least drop by for tea." Suddenly, Stephen realized that he really hadn't called Emily in months. It hadn't been on purpose, he'd just been forgetting. She knew about his depression and how long and difficult it had been for him to come back to life after Evelyn's death. She sympathized with him and Camille. But in all the time he'd been in the hospital, she'd never visited him. Emily didn't feel alone. In fact, she'd lost her daughter a long time ago, the moment Evelyn had married and moved in with Stephen and his mother. They rarely saw each other on the phone, once a year on the promise of so many years. She was used to being alone. Evelyn's mother remembered Evelyn regularly and occasionally regretted that their relationship had turned out this way. It was only after her daughter's death that she was able to accept her husband, whom she had always disliked, and stopped evaluating life with her critical eye. "Emily, I was just calling to say I'd like to come and talk to you the other day," Stephen answered her. "It's been a long time since we've spoken." Indeed, I had forgotten all about it lately. I can't think about anything but work. The woman said she would be very happy to see him, and after arranging a time, she hung up. Stephen then immediately called Wendy and asked her to stop by and pick up the photograph. "No, I certainly don't mind," she replied. When he asked if he could borrow the picture for a few days, "Only why would you want it?" "Let you not ask unnecessary questions," he asked. "Just say yes or no. If you agree to lend it to me, I'll come by tonight and pick it up. And if you don't, then no. I'll try to manage without that picture." Wendy didn't know what he was up to, and when he came to pick up the picture, she didn't ask. They sat and drank tea, talking about life and discussing completely mundane things. They were so good together. Wendy was as interesting a conversationalist with Evelyn as she was with his wife. Stephen felt as if she knew everything in the world. They didn't even notice how the time flew by. It was only when Stephen's phone rang that he realized it was late afternoon. "Yes, Mom, I'll be home soon," he echoed into the receiver, and then immediately disconnected. "Well, should I go?" he said to Wendy, putting the cup of tea on the tray. "Let me in their kitchen. Wash the dishes behind me, and I'll be on my way." "Really?" She laughed. "No need, I carried everything myself, much less wash the dishes. Jenna's getting discharged soon. Will you walk us home from the hospital?" "Of course I will," he said, smiling. "What could we talk about?" "Maybe you can stay at my place tonight," she said, more in an affirmative than a question. "It's late. Let's not rush things." He kissed her on the cheek and drove home. The next evening he sat opposite Emily, and after waiting for her to pour the almost freshly brewed tea, placed the photographs on the table in front of her. "It can't be," she exclaimed. "Where did you get that?" From the shock that seized her, she could not hold the cup of tea in her hands, and Stephen felt himself burn through his pants. The hot boiling water flew in different directions all over the kitchen. Along with the shards, he got up from his chair and began picking up the pieces of the cup and wiping the floor. Emily sat as still as if she were a frozen statue. She didn't even feel the burns from the boiling water that ran down her arms, and the pain from the spent shard she clutched in her palm. She didn't even notice it. "Where did you get that picture?" asked Emily, who did not regain consciousness until 10 minutes after Stephen had placed it on the table in front of her. "Where did you get it?" When she looked at the picture, she immediately realized that it was not of Evelyn. This woman looked a lot like her, but she was different. Evelyn had never had a mole on her neck, but this woman did. How one could not notice it, she did not understand. So she was greatly surprised when Stephen told her about meeting Wendy and how he was sure it was Evelyn in the picture. "Yes, I guess it's time to tell you how it really was," she muttered quietly, looking at Stephen. "I didn't think the truth would ever come out. But since it did, then listen, yes, I did give birth to twins. 2 twin girls. But raising 2 kids wasn't part of my plan. I persuaded the midwife to take the second girl. Naturally, it was all unofficial. I gave a lot of money to hide the truth. But the midwife promised me that she would put the girl in a good family. She gave me her word that the child would not end up in an orphanage. Even before the birth, she told me that there are many childless couples from the upper classes who want a child very much, but for one reason or another cannot have children. I was sure she wasn't lying to me. If only I had known, she cried quietly. But looking at her, Stephen felt no pity. He did not believe a word Emily said. "You will excuse me, of course, but I think you are lying," he said. "You are a very cynical and unscrupulous man. That's the way you were, that's the way you are. Your grandmother got you an apartment. You lived much better than other families. Evelyn told me, but you just didn't want a family or children. You only got married because you had to. You never had much love for the faith either. You raised them because you were afraid of abandonment. And you didn't feel sorry for the child, you felt sorry for yourself. Were you afraid of judgment from your family, from your friends, from the community? At the funeral, when I saw how you felt about Evelyn's death, I believed for a second that you were a normal person. But now I see that I was very wrong. You weren't even upset when I told you that your other daughter was dead too? How much do you understand?" Emily, who had been trying to be polite up to this point, blurted out, "You didn't live at that time, and you don't know what it's like. Now you young people have both freedom of choice and opportunity. You can become anything you want to be if you want to. Even if you change your profession now at your relatively respectable age, no one will say a word to you. And you can do even better if you leave your medicine and go up into the same commerce. We had no such opportunities. There was no normal housing. We all lived wherever we could, and my grandmother, with great difficulty, thanks to her connections, managed to get my parents a 2-room apartment, although we were not entitled to it. My father and mother had only 1 daughter. And if it wasn't for my grandmother, we would have been living on each other's heads. Then, with great difficulty, she managed to get another apartment. It is frightening to imagine what she did and risked for this. Where is it seen that a simple family, where there are not 7 at home and so many square meters? If she had not registered me there in time, we would have lived together with my parents in this 2-bedroom. They are in 1 room on each other's heads, and we checking in the other a lot. You know, you're already hatched at another time. Evelyn too, our time. Try getting into the same medical program without connections. Never in your life. All your life you work hard and have nothing with no money, no traveling, no fancy clothes, nothing, working, raising kids, eating pasta and surviving. I'd hang myself alone with 2 kids. Christopher, my husband, was no help either, only interfered underfoot. I wanted to live alone for myself and in a separate apartment, not in a dorm with neighbors. I gave birth, but only because it was necessary and otherwise not accepted. If my youth had passed to this time, I would never have given birth in my life. And about Evelyn, it's not for you to judge how I felt about her. I have always loved my daughter and wanted the best for her, only wished the best for her. And I certainly never dreamed of her marrying someone as simple as herself, and lived the rest of her life. Just like that. Work, home, chores, kids, then work again. He didn't listen to what she was saying, left the table and headed for the exit. "Emily, please close the door." Stephen asked politely, "It's time for me to go home." She silently went to the door and, when Stephen left the apartment, turned the lock. On the way home, Stephen couldn't think about anything. He would have preferred not to hear it all, but he wanted to know the truth, and he did. No matter how horrible it was, there was no going back. And that realization, it no longer hurt him as much as it had a few years ago. Sometimes he felt as if everything that had happened in his life would have happened as if it hadn't happened to him. From time to time, Stephen had the feeling that he had just watched some serial movie. The protagonist had too many trials for one simple man. He only came back to reality when he saw Evelyn's picture. In his head again surfaced pictures of their life together, but he no longer felt such a burning and complementary to the bottom of the void. He had Wendy in his life now, and with each passing day he was letting Evelyn further and further away from him. She would forever remain in his heart, but she would no longer be the meaning of his life. The next day he picked up the phone to an unfamiliar number. It was a call from the police. Stephen did not expect to hear the voice of an investigator after so long. "Good afternoon," the man said. "We found a suspect in your wife's murder. I would like you to come to the station, and we will go over everything that happened on that unfortunate day. We need to be updated to the minute. Maybe you remembered something else in the meantime, some details?" At that moment, Stephen seemed not even to remember what he had originally said. It was all so far in the past that it was unlikely that he would be able to reproduce the events of that day as he had a few years ago. He arrived at the investigator's office immediately after work. He had a short shift that day, and 2 days later Jenna was being discharged from the hospital, whom he had promised to walk home with Wendy. Who did he turn out to be? Stephen asked the investigator when he had finished recording his statement. "Well, the man who killed Evelyn. I'll see him. You'll see him at the trial," the investigator replied. "No one. The most trivial thing is that he was nobody at all. An ordinary worker doing small jobs around the neighborhood. The most ordinary ones. Not a remarkable man. Just out of money. He was walking down the street that day, and when he saw Evelyn in a deserted spot, he decided it wasn't a bad idea to make a quick attack, take his phone, take off his jewelry, pull out his money. He walked from home to the subway and home through the same park every day. That place is a disaster. I don't know why you didn't pick her up from work, let her walk alone in places like this. It's not the first time this has happened. All sorts of bad things happen there on a regular basis. A teenager was chained on the head, his cell phone was taken, some high school kids were robbed. And all this happened in broad daylight. When will this wretched thing be cut down and houses built there? It's been going on for a year now and still nothing. Yeah, by the way, he didn't want to kill her. He was just warming her on the head. He was sure she'd wake up after he left. But you see how it turned out. What's he going to do for it now? Go to jail for a couple of years and then be released? Stephen sighed sadly. What was the point of catching him in the first place? But you don't think well of our law. First of all, 2 years is out of the question. Well, for this crime alone, he will be imprisoned for at least 6 or 7 years, if not more. He's got other episodes on his record. It's not like he's been doing this kind of petty robbery for years. If we can prove it, he'll go to prison for 25 years. And that's just as good as gone. And we can prove it. There was a note of disbelief in Stephen's voice. He couldn't believe his wife's killers had been found. He had long ago lost all hope for justice and resigned himself to the fact that the man who had taken away his most precious possessions would never be punished. "I'm sure he will," the investigator replied firmly. "We've told more than one of them. Be sure to come to the trial." "I will, of course I will." Stephen shook the investigator's hand and, bidding him farewell, went straight to Wendy's. On the way he realized that he had not even called her to warn her about his visit. "Are you home tonight?" he asked her when he was almost there. "I'll be there soon. To be more precise, I'm almost there." "Yes, I'm home today," she replied happily. "I'm waiting for you, of course, come the same day," he proposed to her. "I don't want to sound corny and I apologize for not having a ring," he said, looking into her eyes. "But we'll get everything tomorrow. I promise you." "Oh, come on," Wendy laughed. "I think we'll just have a small wedding with the people closest to us. A quiet celebration with your mom and Jenna. And then we'll be fine. I'm sure Jenna will be very happy that you'll be living with us and that she'll have a daddy." Jenna was overjoyed. After being discharged from the hospital, Stephen took his family to a movie and they spent the entire day together. "Uncle Stephen, when are we going on the carousel at the water park?" asked the excited little girl who was eager for adventure and fun. Wendy promised that we would definitely ride the big wheel. I wanted to ride on one of those a few years ago, but no one ever took me there. We will, Stephen replied. After you recovered a bit, you got hit by a car. This is no joke. Even though you weren't seriously injured, it still takes some time for you to fully recover from the hospital. 3 months later, they got married. Camille was happy for her son. His life was finally getting better and had a new meaning. Jenna became very attached to her and saw the woman as the grandmother she never had. Maybe we could sell our 2 apartments and buy one big one to live together, she suggested Stephen. Well, what's the point of leaving 2 small apartments when we have such a big family? Then it is more logical to sell the apartment our mother and you, and the one we bought, together with Evelyn to leave, he replied. First of all, why make people move out? They're living there quietly and they're not going anywhere yet. So let them continue to live there. Secondly, the mortgage closes on its own. So we'll have to sell the apartment with this encumbrance. And that's a real hassle. I think I'm right. Of course you're right. 3 months later, Evelyn's killer was tried. The man was sentenced to 20 years in prison. As Stephen left the courtroom, he approached the investigator who had handled the case and thanked him again. But I told him that if we managed to prove most of the episodes, then consider it for good. And so it was, said the investigator. Stephen shook his hand and then approached Emily, who also came to the trial. You don't mean that. Serve it up. He said what I said to you the other day. But you know I said some of it in the heat of the moment. But I'm right about some things. Call, write, come and visit. 6 months later, they sold the apartment and bought a big 4-bedroom where they all moved in together. Wendy and Stephen and Jenna and Camille. Emily stopped by regularly to visit them. For the first time in many years of her life, she began to feel lonely. She wanted to socialize with family and friends she hardly had any left. Over time, Jenna got used to her as well. She began to see Emily as a grandmother. Christopher was also a frequent visitor to the house, whose doors were always open to him. Stephen was very happy that after all he had been through, he had found a large and friendly family.